Hi, my name is Patricia Reynolds, but most people just call me Pat. I'm 47 years old. I live in Boise, Idaho, and I work in finance. For most of my life, I believed one simple truth. Family means safety. Your parents, your siblings, your relatives, they're supposed to be the ones you can always trust. But the truth is, sometimes the people you share blood with can hurt you more than anyone else ever could. And in my case, it all began with something so small, so ordinary that I almost ignored it. It started with a missing jacket. It was late August, one of those evenings where the sky turns deep gold just before the sun slips behind the hills. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, windows down, letting the warm air mix with the smell of somebody's barbecue drifting from a few doors down. Usually, I love that time of day. The world feels softer, slower. But when I stepped inside the building, a strange feeling hit me. Right by the door of my apartment, I keep a hook for my spare jacket. That evening, the hook was empty. My blue jacket, the one I'd worn just 2 nights earlier to the grocery store, was gone. At first, I thought, maybe I left it in the car. But no, I clearly remembered hanging it up. A small thing, yes, but something about it felt wrong. The kind of wrong that sits in the back of your mind and doesn't let go. As I stood there frowning at the empty hook, my neighbor, Mrs. Lang from 3B, locked her door. She was the kind of older lady who always noticed everything friendly but sharp-eyed. She gave me her usual smile. "Evening, Pat," she said. "Haven't seen you heading over to your folks' place lately. Everything all right?" Her tone was light, but her eyes studied me in that way people do when they already suspect the answer. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, just been busy." She nodded, but I caught that quick glance, the kind that says, "I know there's more to the story." Then she walked down the hall, leaving me with a knot in my stomach. That night, I told myself it was nothing. A jacket. A nosy neighbor. Don't overthink it. But deep down, I knew this was the first thread being pulled from a much bigger knot. The next morning, I drove across town to drop off a children's book my niece had left in my car. I figured it was a good excuse to stop by my parents' house, even though something in me hesitated. As I turned into their street, the first thing I noticed was the garage door, halfway open. My dad, Harold, was obsessive about keeping it closed. He'd check twice before bed just to be sure. Seeing it hanging wide like that was out of character. I walked through the side door, calling out, "Hello?" The air inside smelled like fresh coffee, mixed with a faint floral scent. My footsteps carried me to my old bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. The drawers were pulled open, my jewelry box tilted on its side. A faint trace of perfume mine hung in the air, even though I hadn't lived there for years. And worse, the framed photo of me with my late mother was gone, along with a small leather holder I used for a backup debit card. I froze. My mom's photo was priceless to me. It wasn't just a picture she had written a note on the back in her own handwriting, and now it was gone. From the kitchen, I heard my dad's voice, low, followed by Margaret's laugh. Margaret is my stepmother, and the laugh didn't sound right. Too bright, too forced, like she was trying to cover something. I didn't say a word. I just left the children's book on the table, turned, and walked out. The garage door still yawned wide as I drove away. The afternoon sun pressed hot against the car windows. But inside, I felt cold. My mind kept circling back. The missing jacket, the half-open garage, the ransacked bedroom, the missing photo. Maybe each of those things alone could be explained. But together? They formed a pattern. A whisper of warning. That whisper only grew louder later that day. I stopped by the motorcycle showroom where my sister-in-law Susan worked. I had a baby shower invitation for one of her co-workers, and honestly, I just wanted to check in, see if she'd act normal. The showroom blasted me with air conditioning and the smell of rubber tires. Susan spotted me right away, her smile a little too quick, a little too bright. "Pat, what a surprise. Hot enough out there for you?" We made small talk about the heat wave, the county fair, the usual. Everything seemed fine until she tilted her head mid-conversation and asked, "Do you check your bank app often? I've been so bad about mine lately." The question landed heavy, random, out of place. I kept my expression neutral, answering casually, "When I think about it." She nodded, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and smirked just a little. Then she changed the subject, talking about a new shipment of bikes. But I wasn't listening. My mind was already connecting the dots. My bedroom disturbed, my debit card holder missing, and now Susan probing me about my bank account. Once is a coincidence. Twice is a pattern. 3 times? That's a plan. As I drove home that evening, the golden Idaho sky looked heavier, like a storm waiting to break. I set my phone face up on the passenger seat, silent, waiting. I didn't know it yet, but the next notification that popped up on that screen would shatter everything I thought I knew about family. Thursday afternoons at the office were usually quiet. My desk sat by the front window, so the sunlight streamed in at an angle that made it hard to read my computer screen. Still, I didn't mind. After years in finance, I'd learned to appreciate those calm afternoons when nothing much happened. That day, I was buried in spreadsheets, reconciling end-of-month numbers, when my phone buzzed against the desk. I didn't think twice. Probably an email ad, maybe a calendar reminder. But when I glanced down, I froze. It wasn't junk. It was a push notification from my bank. Purchase confirmed, $48,000. My eyes widened. SUV, motorcycle, both listed on the statement. For a second, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of scam text, a phishing trick. But then I tapped it open, and my heart dropped. There it was, my gold credit card, the one I kept locked away for real emergencies, and 2 charges back to back, totaling nearly $50,000. My hands went cold. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like watching a stranger's hand reach straight into my wallet. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers. My pulse thudded in my ears. I'd worked hard for every dollar in that account. I wasn't rich. That card was my safety net, the one thing I saved for when life knocked me down. And now, in one afternoon, someone had gutted it. My first instinct was to grab my keys, drive across town, storm into my parents' house, and demand answers. But another voice in my head, calmer, sharper, told me to wait. If you rush, they'll twist it. If you storm in, they'll call you dramatic. You need evidence, you need control. I forced myself to inhale slowly. Then I clicked into the transaction details. The dealership's address popped up. My stomach turned. It was less than a mile from the motorcycle showroom where Susan worked. That wasn't coincidence. I dialed the bank, my voice steady even though I felt anything but. The representative confirmed the purchases. She reminded me gently that since the card was in my name, I was liable unless I could prove otherwise. I thanked her, hung up, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the desk. My father's voice floated up from memory, sharp and smug. In this family, we share everything. Back then, I'd brushed it off as one of his folksy sayings. Now, it sounded like a warning, a rule. They hadn't stumbled into this by accident. They believed it was their right. That evening, I had already promised my downstairs neighbor, Dan, that I'd stop by his annual end-of-summer barbecue. I almost canceled. But then I thought, no, go. Listen, people always talk when they think you're not paying attention. The smell of grilled corn and charcoal filled the backyard. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, while adults balanced paper plates piled high with potato salad. I accepted a glass of sweet tea from Dan's wife and tried to settle into the noise. That's when a man I vaguely recognized from across the street leaned in. "Hey, I heard your folks finally got the car they deserve," he said, his voice casual but his eyes bright with gossip. The words hit me like a stone. The car they deserve, not a car they bought, not a new car. That phrasing, it sounded rehearsed, like part of a story already being passed around. I curved my mouth into a polite smile. "Is that so?" "Yep," he said. Saw it parked in their driveway yesterday. Sharp-looking SUV, heard they've been saving for a while. I nodded, but inside, rage burned hot. They weren't just spending my money. They were rewriting the story, painting themselves as disciplined savers, finally rewarding themselves. Meanwhile, I was the invisible donor, erased from the picture entirely. Good for them, I said, my tone light. Then I turned the conversation back to the neighborhood block party. But inside, something hardened. This wasn't just theft, it was choreography. Step by step, they were laying groundwork to protect their version of events. To make sure, by the time I figured it all out, the neighborhood already believed their story. Driving home later, the air felt thick and heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already behind in a game I hadn't even agreed to play. In the rearview mirror, the sky glowed orange and purple, but to me, it looked like warning lights. I thought of my missing photo, my missing card holder, Susan's smirk, the neighbor's words, and now, a $48,000 hole in my emergency fund. Patterns don't lie. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, replaying every detail. At dawn, I gave up and brewed a pot of coffee. Sitting at my kitchen table, I whispered to myself, if they were bold enough to steal this once, they've probably done it before. I opened the closet where I'd stashed boxes from old moves, receipts, letters, half-forgotten files. My fingers sifted through years of paper until I found an envelope with my father's handwriting across the front. It said, car insurance. The date was 5 years old. I opened it. My chest tightened. It wasn't insurance. It was a loan agreement. With my name printed neatly at the top, my signature at the bottom, and the same dealership address as yesterday's SUV purchase. The signature was off the loops wrong, the pressure uneven. It wasn't mine. 5 years ago, I'd been juggling part-time jobs, barely keeping up with bills. Around that time, my parents had taken a sudden beach vacation, posting photos of seafood platters and sunsets. I'd believed them when they said they'd used their savings. Now I knew better. My hands trembled as I slipped the document into a fresh manila folder. I wrote one word on the tab, truth, and I locked it in my desk drawer. Later that day, I met an old high school friend for coffee. His name was Michael. We hadn't seen each other in years, but he leaned forward halfway through our catch-up and said something that stopped me cold. I probably shouldn't even tell you this, he whispered. But last year, I overheard your dad at a charity event. He was bragging, saying how easy it is to use family money when you raise them right. And then Margaret chimed in. She said, Pat's our rainy day fund. I sat there, coffee untouched, my face still. But inside, something snapped. This wasn't just theft. This was theater. They were proud of it. They laughed about it in public. I looked Michael in the eye and said, family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up with love. Today, you did that. Thank you. When I walked back to my car, the sky was bright, but all I felt was darkness. By Saturday, I knew distance wasn't enough. This wasn't going to fade if I ignored it. The $48,000 charge, the forged loan, the gossip, none of it was an accident. I needed to look my parents in the eye, so I called Margaret. I asked to meet, not at the house, but at a diner. Neutral ground. She hesitated, then agreed. On the drive there, I rehearsed my words. Facts first, emotions later. My mentor once told me, never go to war unarmed. Truth is your weapon, and I intended to keep mine sharp. As I stepped into the diner, the bell over the door jingled. My parents were already there, sitting side by side, presenting a united front. Their expressions were calm, too calm. I slid into the booth across from them. The waitress poured coffee. I set my phone on the table, the glowing bank alert between us. This hit my account 2 days ago, I said evenly. A new SUV and a motorcycle. $48,000, both on my gold card. My father leaned back, smirk tugging at his mouth. We deserve this more than you. You're young. You'll make more money. Margaret nodded, adding, we've given you everything over the years. Don't act like this is such a big deal. We're family. It's all the same pot. My pulse thundered, but I kept my face calm. Inside, I cataloged every word, every justification, every piece of entitlement. They weren't defending themselves. They were confessing. And they didn't even realize it. Sunday morning arrived with sunlight that looked warm but carried a hidden chill. I barely slept after the diner confrontation. My father's smirk replayed in my mind, Margaret's dismissive tone echoing like a drumbeat. We deserve this more than you. You'll make more money. No apology, no shame. Just entitlement wrapped up as family loyalty. And now, there was no turning back. That afternoon, my extended family was gathering for a barbecue at my cousin's place. Normally, these get-togethers were loud but harmless paper plates stacked with ribs and coleslaw, kids running barefoot through the grass, uncles swapping old stories that had been told 100 times before. But this time, the stakes were different. I knew Harold and Margaret would be there, and I knew exactly what they'd bring, their stolen trophies. The SUV and the motorcycle gleaming in the sun like proof of a story they'd already been spreading. Sure enough, when I pulled up, the SUV sat angled at the front of the driveway, positioned like it was part of a showroom display. The chrome gleamed so bright it hurt my eyes, and from the yard I could already hear my father's booming laugh, that deep performative sound he used whenever he wanted to hold court. Inside, the living room buzzed with chatter. Cousins I hadn't seen in years balanced paper plates. My aunts clustered in corners, gossiping. The smell of barbecue sauce clung to the air. I smiled politely, nodded, but my eyes scanned the yard until I spotted Aunt Helen. She stood in the shade near the patio, speaking quietly with Uncle Raymond. Raymond was the eldest in the family, the one whose opinion still carried weight. If anyone could help tilt the truth into the open, it was him. But for now, I bided my time. Sure enough, in the yard, my father and Margaret were exactly as I expected. Phones in hand, flipping through photos of the SUV and motorcycle, retelling the same rehearsed story to anyone who would listen. Finally decided to treat ourselves, Harold said, puffing out his chest. Margaret smiled sweetly at the cluster of relatives, her voice soft but firm. We've been saving for years. Felt like it was time. Everyone around them nodded approvingly, as though they were witnessing an inspiring achievement. My stomach twisted. They weren't just stealing my money, they were stealing my reputation, my narrative, and replacing it with their own. Eventually, one of my uncles clapped his hands and called out, "Let's take a look at the new SUV." The crowd shuffled toward the driveway. I stayed at the back, silent, watching. There it was, shining under the afternoon sun. My father beamed with pride, explaining features as though he had earned every inch of polished metal. Cousins leaned in, admiring the leather seats. A few even teased me with half-joking comments. "Jealous yet, Pat?" I smiled faintly, but inside, my pulse beat steady. I had been waiting for this moment. Quietly, I reached into my bag. My fingers closed around the small, familiar shape of the spare key fob. Without a word, I pressed the button. The SUV's lights flashed. The horn chirped, sharp and unmistakable. A hush fell over the group. Heads turned. My father's smile faltered, just for a second, before he forced a laugh. "Must have stolen that back, huh?" he joked, trying to brush it off. I met his eyes, calm, steady. It's hard to steal something that was mine to begin with. A ripple went through the crowd, murmurs, raised eyebrows. The tension in the air shifted like a storm cloud rolling in. I turned then, deliberately, and walked to where Uncle Raymond stood. My bag still hung from my shoulder, heavy with more than just a key fob. "Would you mind reading this for me?" I asked, pulling out the manila folder Aunt Helen had given me days earlier. Inside was the contract, the SUV purchase agreement, my name printed clean across the top. Raymond adjusted his glasses and unfolded the paper. His voice was steady but carried enough weight to silence the yard. Buyer's name, he read, Patricia Reynolds. He continued, every word echoing louder than the last. The dealership address, the dates, the signature forged in ink. When he finished, silence hung thick. My father stepped forward, his laugh brittle. That's just paperwork to help her build credit. But Raymond cut him off with a look, a sharp, disappointed look that said more than words ever could. It doesn't read like that to me, he said firmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. That's the only truth I'll be sharing today, I said, placing the contract gently on the hood of the SUV. Then I turned and walked back inside, leaving the paper there in plain sight. Behind me, murmurs swelled. A cousin whispered. An aunt gasped. And I knew in that moment the ground under Harold and Margaret's story had started to crack. They wanted a stage, but I had just turned it into a courtroom. Inside the house, I found Aunt Helen again. Her eyes met mine, filled with a quiet pride. She didn't say much, just a small nod, the kind that said, "You did what needed to be done." The barbecue went on, but the air had shifted. Conversations were hushed. Side glances darted toward the driveway where my father stood red-faced beside the SUV. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her phone clutched in her hand like it might still save her. I didn't stay long after that. I'd made my point, and as I walked away, I knew the whispers would grow louder. Once people see cracks, they can't unsee them. The next morning, as I stepped outside with a bag of trash, my neighbor Joran from across the street called out. He carried the day's newspaper under his arm and gave me a knowing smile. "Quite the scene at your cousin's place yesterday," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You were there?" "Not exactly, but word travels. People started asking questions after you left. Your dad couldn't give a straight answer. And well, you know how it goes. Avoid a question long enough and folks figure out you're hiding something." The corners of my mouth lifted slightly. "Let me guess, somebody filmed it?" Joran chuckled. "More than one somebody. Wouldn't be surprised if clips are floating around by the weekend." That was better than I dared hope. First-hand witnesses were one thing. Video was another. Truth captured on camera had a way of spreading faster than any rumor. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a new text. The sender's name lit up the screen. Margaret. "Sorry about the misunderstanding," it read, "but we still need your PIN for something urgent." I stared at the words. The faux apology. The sudden pivot into a demand. It was the same tactic they'd always used, guilt mixed with expectation, an endless cycle of take. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I took a screenshot and slid it into my growing truth folder, alongside the forged loan, the dealership contract, the bank alerts. Piece by piece, their story was unraveling, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than dread. I felt resolve. Saturday morning began quietly. I sat at my kitchen table, a mug of coffee steaming in my hands. For the first time all week, the air felt still, like the held breath before a curtain rises. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was my contact at the finance company, the one who'd been quietly working with me behind the scenes. Her voice was calm. "The repossession orders have been processed. The driver's on his way." My heart leapt. I grabbed my keys, left the coffee half drunk on the table, and drove. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, the tow truck was already there. Its engine rumbled low, the hydraulic ramp lowering with a steady whine. The SUV sat in the driveway, gleaming in the sun, polished like a trophy. My father crouched by the motorcycle, rag in hand, buffing chrome as though he hadn't stolen a dime. The driver moved with practiced precision. Chains rattled, clamps locked, and then, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My father's voice exploded across the yard. He dropped the rag, storming toward the truck in sandals, his face red. The driver didn't flinch. He simply said, flat, almost bored, "Repossession under the lender's authorization. Any disputes need to go through them." My stepmother Margaret burst from the house, phone already raised, recording like she was building her own defense. Her voice was sharp, shrill. "We have proof you're taking what's ours." She turned slightly, angling toward neighbors who had stepped onto their porches, drawn by the noise. But the driver didn't stop. The SUV rolled up the ramp, metal clanging against metal, until the gleaming car was no longer theirs to polish. Then, as if to twist the knife, the driver swung the truck toward the motorcycle. My father lunged forward, shouting, "You can't take that! That's ours!" The driver didn't blink. "Sir, both vehicles are under the same order." Within minutes, both trophies, SUV and motorcycle, were strapped tight on the flatbed. I stayed a few houses down, sitting in my car, windows rolled up. My parents never saw me, but I saw everything. Neighbors filming with their phones, kids watching wide-eyed from the sidewalk. The show was no longer private. It was a spectacle, and every angle was being recorded. My father stood in the driveway, chest heaving, fists clenched. Margaret clutched her phone like a lifeline, her voice shrill, trying to spin the moment into a narrative of victimhood. But it was too late. The image was burned into the street, into the neighborhood, into the truth. The cars were never theirs. The tow truck pulled away, chains rattling, sunlight glinting off the stolen chrome as it disappeared down the block, and I exhaled. Justice didn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it came with hydraulics and chains. That afternoon, I sat in my attorney's office. The blinds were drawn, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence between us. He slid a printed letter across the desk. Every word was precise, stripped of emotion. It demanded full repayment, plus damages. Attached were copies of everything: the bank notifications, screenshots of the text demanding my PIN, the forged loan document, the dealership contract with my forged signature, and the recording of my parents admitting in their own words that they deserved what they had taken. "This goes out certified mail and email," my attorney said, tapping the letter. "They won't be able to claim they never saw it." I read the letter twice. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about the cars. It was about drawing a line, ink on paper, a boundary they could no longer cross. I signed at the bottom. The next week felt strange. No calls, no angry knocks at my door, just silence. At first, it was disorienting. After months of chaos, quiet felt suspicious. But then I realized silence was freedom. I started walking in the mornings again, reclaiming streets I'd once avoided. I greeted neighbors, waved at joggers. Even the light in my apartment felt different, brighter, cleaner. For the first time in years, I could leave my phone on the counter without bracing every time it buzzed. One morning, I remembered a quote I'd read long ago. "Sometimes the most dangerous place is the one you've always called home." I thought I understood it then, but now I knew it in my bones. Home wasn't a building. Home was where you allowed yourself to be safe, and for years I had allowed myself to be within their reach. Midweek, I opened my inbox to find an unexpected email. It was from Mrs. Alden, my old high school economics teacher. "Pat," it began, "I saw your name in the local business journal. Congratulations on the growth of your consulting work. I always knew you'd build something worthwhile." She went on to recall a memory I'd nearly forgotten. A day in class when I had stood up for another student, laying out the facts so clearly that the room fell silent. "You didn't raise your voice," she wrote. "You simply told the truth, and it was enough. Don't ever let small-minded people make you question that." Tears stung my eyes. Her words reminded me of something I had almost lost: my own strength. The family I was born into might never respect me. But respect, real respect, could come from others. From people who saw me, not as a wallet, not as a resource, but as a person. By Friday, I was already planning the next phase of my business. 2 new clients, a stronger foundation, everything on my own terms. I also began reaching out to old friends, people I'd lost touch with when constant family emergencies had drained all my energy. One lunch turned into a weekend hike. Another friend invited me to a networking event. For the first time, I said yes. And on Saturday, I bought myself something small but meaningful. A new desk chair, nothing extravagant, just comfortable, supportive. I put it together myself, each screw clicking into place like a small declaration. This is mine, paid for by me, chosen by me. No apologies, no explanations. And as I sat down in it for the first time, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for their apologies, not for their approval, not for their love. They had taken enough. And now, finally, I was taking back. The silence didn't last long. A week after the repossession, I came home from work to find a thick envelope wedged between my screen door and the frame. The return address made my chest tighten. Harrison and Lowe, attorneys at law. I carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and stared at it. The weight of the envelope felt heavier than paper, heavier than ink. I tore it open. Inside were neatly stapled pages. The language was stiff, impersonal, almost surgical. Our clients, Harold and Margaret Reynolds, deny all allegations of fraud. They assert ownership of said vehicles. They contend that any signatures provided were made with full knowledge and consent. And then, the final blow. Furthermore, they allege undue harassment and emotional distress caused by Patricia Reynolds. I read it twice, then 3 times. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I poured a glass of water and walked to the window. Outside, the late summer sun stretched long shadows across the yard. A neighbor watered her garden. Somewhere, a dog barked. The world carried on, ordinary and steady, while my own family was putting their betrayal into legal ink. They weren't just denying the truth, they were painting me as the villain. That night, I called Aunt Helen. Her voice was soft but firm. "They'll try everything to flip the story," she said. "But paper doesn't lie, Pat. You have the bank records. You have the contracts. Don't let their noise shake you." I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. Paper doesn't lie. A few days later, I met with my attorney again. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the blinds drawn against the afternoon glare. He skimmed through the letter, lips pressed in a thin line. Then he looked up. "This isn't surprising. Denial is the first move in cases like this. But notice what's missing. They don't contest the repossession. They don't contest the bank alerts. They're only attacking you personally. That tells me they know the paper is against them." I nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" He leaned back in his chair. "Now we file. Court papers. This stops being a family matter and becomes a case number. You ready for that?" The question hung heavy in the air. Ready? Number nobody's ever ready to sue their own parents. But necessary? Absolutely. I drew in a breath, steadying myself. Yes, file it. The weeks that followed felt like standing in 2 different worlds. In one, life carried on. I worked. I met with clients. I cooked dinner, watered plants, tried to sleep. In the other, I gathered evidence. Every document, every receipt, every message. I built folders on my computer labeled by month and subject. My desk drawer filled with manila envelopes, each one heavier than the last. And slowly, the weight shifted. It wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. It was proof against performance, paper against pretense. One afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store. As I reached for a carton of eggs, I overheard 2 women by the dairy aisle whispering. "Can you believe it?" one said. "Harold and Margaret being sued by their own daughter." The other clucked her tongue. "I heard she's doing it for money." For a second, my throat tightened. The old fear rose, the fear of being misunderstood, judged, cast as ungrateful. But then I looked down at the carton in my hands. Fresh eggs, paid with my card. My money, no one else's. I exhaled slowly and walked away. Let them whisper. Truth has its own legs. By September, the court summons had been filed. A date circled itself on my calendar in red ink. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch with a blanket around my shoulders, staring at the stack of papers on the coffee table. This was it, the final break. Not just emotionally, legally. I thought back to the little girl I used to be. The one who believed family meant safety, who believed her father's laugh was strength, her stepmother's approval was love. I wished I could reach across time, put my arms around that girl, and tell her the truth. You are not crazy. You are not selfish. You are not wrong for wanting to be safe. The morning of the hearing, I dressed simply. Navy blazer, black slacks, no jewelry except a small silver ring my mother had given me years ago. When I walked into the courthouse, the smell of disinfectant and old wood filled the air. My footsteps echoed against the marble floor. At the end of the hall, my parents stood with their lawyer. Harold's face was set in a mask of stone. Margaret glanced at me once, her lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. I didn't look away. I walked past them, into the courtroom, and sat down beside my attorney. For once, it wasn't their stage. It wasn't their story. It was the law's. The hearing itself was brief, procedural. Dates were set. Evidence deadlines established. The judge's voice was calm, almost detached. But to me, it felt monumental, because for the first time, their lies weren't just mine to fight. They were bound to a process bigger than both of us, a system with rules, a system with consequences. When it ended, I stepped outside into the sunlight. The courthouse steps were warm beneath my shoes. The sky stretched wide and blue above me. I inhaled deeply, and for the first time in months, the air felt light. That evening, back at home, I pulled out my mother's old note again. Stand still. The truth has its own legs. I placed it in the folder with my court papers, because now, finally, truth was walking on its own, and I was walking with it. Autumn came quietly that year. Leaves turned gold, drifting onto sidewalks in slow spirals. The mornings grew cooler, the air sharper. And inside me, something was changing too. The case never turned into the courtroom drama movies like to show. There were no gasps, no last-minute confessions. Instead, there were motions, deadlines, negotiations. Paper stacked on paper until truth weighed too much to ignore. By November, the cracks in my parents' defense were obvious. Their lawyer requested extensions. Their affidavits contradicted each other. And when the dealership provided surveillance footage of the purchase, showing Margaret signing with my forged name, the last thread snapped. They settled. Quietly. Without apology. Without eye contact. The vehicles were already gone. The money was returned, though scarred by legal fees. But the victory wasn't in the dollars. It was in the silence that followed. For the first time in years, my phone stayed still. No demands. No guilt-laced calls. No strings pulling me back. Thanksgiving arrived. I didn't go to the old family table. Instead, I hosted dinner in my own apartment. Just a few friends, Aunt Helen, Uncle Raymond. We sat around a mismatched collection of chairs, the turkey slightly overcooked, the pumpkin pie a little lopsided. But the laughter was real, the stories unforced. As I poured coffee after dessert, Helen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You chose peace," she said simply. "That's harder than choosing war." Her words settled into me like warmth. Winter came. Work grew steady. Clients referred others. My small business, once just a fragile dream, began to take shape, strong and rooted. I bought a new couch, painted my bedroom, put photos on the wall that I had chosen myself. Sunsets from a trip with friends, a candid shot of me laughing, a framed copy of my mother's note. Every corner of my home began to look like me, not like survival, not like borrowed space, but like belonging. One evening, I walked past a holiday display downtown. Families clustered around the glowing lights. Parents lifted kids onto their shoulders. Laughter rose into the cold night air. I paused, watching. A pang of sadness nudged at me the reminder that my own family wasn't there. Not really. That we'd severed ties in a way that could never be mended. But then I noticed something. Standing nearby was my friend Michael, the one who'd warned me months ago. He waved, handed me a cup of hot cider, and soon others joined us. Neighbors, colleagues, people who had chosen to stand with me. I realized then, family isn't just blood. It's who shows up, who sees you, who cares without keeping score. And for the first time, I felt whole. By spring, the lawsuit was just a file in an archive. My parents faded into silence. No letters, no visits, no more stories spun in backyards. I won't lie, some nights, grief still crept in. Grief for the family I wished I had, for the father I used to imagine, for the home that should have been safe. But grief is a visitor, not a roommate. It comes, it lingers, then it leaves, and in its place grows something stronger: freedom. One afternoon, sitting at my new desk chair, sunlight pouring through the window, I opened a blank notebook. At the top of the page, I wrote, Chapter 1. Not of their story, not of the tangled past, but of mine. Looking back, I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I see myself as someone who walked through fire and came out carrying her own light. They took money, time, even pieces of my trust, but they didn't take me, and that's what matters. The last line of my mother's note still echoes in my heart. The truth has its own legs. It carried me here, to peace, to strength, to a new life that belongs to me. And this time, I'm not giving it away. In the end, Pat's story isn't just about betrayal or money. It's about courage, about learning that family is not who takes from you, but who truly stands beside you. Through heartbreak, she found strength. Through silence, she found peace. And by choosing truth, she finally reclaimed her life. If you've ever felt trapped by expectations or weighed down by someone else's choices, remember this: you have the right to protect your peace, and it's never too late to begin again. Thank you for watching. If this story spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. And always remember, you matter, and your love leaves a mark.